institution. Ms. Debbie, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ekaterina. And I'd really like to start by extending my enormous thanks to the entire Office of the Public Defender of Georgia, and especially Ekaterina Shkidadze for the incredible leadership of ENRI's working group on disabilities. And it is such a pleasure to host this webinar on inclusive education for persons with disabilities during COVID, and to host it with the Office of the Public Defender, with whom we have really enjoyed working over these years. I'd also like to congratulate all members of ENRI's CRPD working group for the incredible work that they have continued to deliver, including during the COVID context. We not only have ENRI's members, NHRIs, and also our observers of the CRPD working group with us. We have national quality bodies, international organizations, NGOs, many other representatives at this webinar, and I'd like to welcome you all. Indeed, I'm very proud that ENRI is hosting this webinar on education for persons with disabilities during COVID, because it is such an important area to work upon. Persons with disabilities clearly have been impacted more than other groups in the COVID-19 context. And really, the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic and associated measures has really exposed and exacerbated the pre-existing barriers that persons with disabilities face in participating fully in society. Indeed, COVID-19 has also shown the multiple dimensions that have impacted on children's well-being, and especially children with disabilities and their access to education. Clearly, this area needs to have more work done, but the COVID pandemic has also shone a spotlight on this area. It has shown the public interest and indeed further work of state authorities and all of us here today to help to make education more inclusive for persons with disabilities. I believe that this public attention gives us a golden opportunity to rethink the approach. And we have seen that in some countries there are new laws or policies or approaches to try and include persons with disabilities more in the education that is offered in those countries. But clearly there is still a lot more work to be done. Therefore, and against that backdrop, the objective of today's webinar is really to exchange experiences, to give opinions, good practices, ideas and methodologies, so that we can all learn more and work towards implementing high quality, inclusive education for persons with disabilities, both during and beyond the pandemic. So I wish you all very fruitful discussions, and it is now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, the Public Defender of Georgia, Nino Lumjaria, who will now take the floor and add to this welcome. Thank you, Nino.
Thank you, Debbie, for introducing me. Good afternoon and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues from fellow NHRIs and Ombuds institution. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome you all to the webinar Right to Education of Persons with Disabilities during COVID-19 pandemic, organized by the Georgian Public Defender's Office and European Network of National Human Rights Institutions. Dear distinguished guest speakers and attendees, I would like to thank you for your interest and participation in this webinar. I also would like to express my gratitude and appreciation to the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions, as this webinar is a result of our joint efforts. I would like to thank the ENRI CRPD working group, which has made the realization of the right to education of persons with disabilities one of the priorities in the context of the pandemic. And last but not least, special thanks to our speakers at the international and national levels, whose opinions are crucial in future activities aimed at protecting and promoting the right to education of persons with disabilities. Let me begin by underlining that today, almost 2 years after the outbreak of the global pandemic, it is no longer disputed that coronavirus-related restrictions have had a disproportionately negative impact on the rights of persons with disabilities worldwide. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities publicly expresses concerns that states have failed to meet their commitments to protect the rights of persons with disabilities in accordance with the Convention, and that their rights have been violated and to varying degrees and in different directions. One must also note that right to education is one of the most important social rights and a precondition for the independent living of persons with disabilities and realization of their other rights. However, practice and numerous studies showed inequality between children with disabilities and children without disabilities in terms of exercise of their rights to education during the pandemic. One of the most common measures used globally during COVID-19 pandemic has been the suspension of the learning process in the physical space of general education institutions and the introduction of remote learning. However, access to quality education in the new reality has been accompanied by a number of new challenges for students with disabilities, especially for students with special educational needs, ranging from the problem of access to internet and technical equipment to the establishment of effective communication in distance learning. It is particularly noteworthy that in the early stages of the pandemic, students with disabilities were left out of school in many countries. Only later did educational system begin to take care of the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the educational process. This care was substantial in some cases, but just formal in others. In conclusion, the pandemic can be used as an opportunity to redesign the education system so that to make it more inclusive and more accessible to students with disabilities. In this regard, the exchange of information between states about their best practices is of the utmost importance. I firmly believe that today's webinar will help to identify the substantive discussions on this issue between countries and will assist states in planning education system tailored to the needs of the students with disabilities. Now, I would like to give floor to Ms. Ekaterina Schiladze, Deputy Public Defender of Georgia, Chair of INRI CRPD Working Group, which will be moderating today's webinar. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ms. Lomjaria, for giving me the floor. And at the outset, let me express my gratitude to Ms. Connor and Ms. Lomjaria for their excellent welcome remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, it is an honor for me to moderate the first panel and follow-up discussions. It has been an amazing experience to chair ENRI CRPD Working Group, and I'm happy that we organized this webinar to share existing practices, recommendations, and lessons learned regarding the implementation of the right to education for persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others, in order to promote their independent living and an opportunity to contribute to the society. The webinar will be divided in two panels. The first panel will be dedicated to international and regional perspectives, and the second panel will be dedicated to NHRI perspectives. There will be an open floor for questions and discussions after each panel, so you can type questions in a chat bar during the presentation, or you can also intervene after each panel and share your views and questions. And I think we can start the first panels. Let me remind you that focus of today's webinar will be on the right to education of persons with disabilities during COVID-19 pandemic. We will have two speakers in the first panel who will share their perspectives on the main topic of the webinar. The first presenter of the webinar will be Ms. Catherine Pedreros, who serves as an acting secretary of the UN Committee on the Right of Persons with Disabilities. Ms. Pedreros has worked for the UNCRPD Committee Secretariat for the past 9 years, and today she will share with us the committee's perspective on the right to education of persons with disabilities during COVID-19 pandemic. Ms. Catherine, floor is yours.
Good morning, Katrine. And good morning, colleagues of the European National Human Rights Institutions. And thank you for this warm welcoming today to participate in this webinar. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to take part in this webinar today. And I appreciate really your efforts in organizing and inviting the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Right holders under all right treaties have been negatively affected by the crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, but some have been at a higher risk and have faced disproportionate negative impacts. This is the case of persons with disabilities, many of them children with disabilities, many of them persons with disabilities still facing segregation and living in segregated settings, residences, homes, special boarding schools, all types of psychiatric settings, and many of them women with disabilities facing exclusion and gender-based violence at home and in public spheres. Human rights mechanisms too have been impacted, and you all well know this. And their effectiveness and response have also been limited by different measures taken to contain the pandemic. This is the case of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which could not keep the dialogue, their constructive dialogue, with the state parties to the convention at the same pace it had before the pandemic. In 2020, the committee postponed its session that was to be held in March, April 2020, and only reconvened online sessions in the second semester of 2020. In the last year, the committee held 3 constructive dialogues only with the state parties of Djibouti, Estonia, and France, who accepted to hold online dialogues with the committee. The opportunity to discuss today the right to quality, inclusive education under Article 24 of the CRPD, and to hear from your experience on what is taking place at the European level will be crucial for me as officer in charge of the Secretariat and in better supporting the work of the committee during the next period, when we expect it will reconvene in-person sessions in Geneva. It is also an opportunity for national human rights institutions and other independent bodies to think about other opportunities that have to continue engaging with the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and with other human rights mechanisms at the universal level. I would like to start by stressing or by putting forward today, this morning, my main message. My main message today is that the content and all aspects of the right to inclusive quality education developed under international law in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities continues to be applicable and should not be suspended during emergencies, including the COVID-19 pandemic. and it should be at the core of the recovery phase after the pandemic. I would like to refer first. I will refer to 3 different aspects today to convey my message. The first one is the content of Article 11 of the Convention and the CRPD, as the Convention is the only convention including obligations for state parties concerning humanitarian situations. In my second part, I will refer to the essential components or core components of Article 24 in the Convention, which is quality inclusive education. You may recall that the committee already developed thematically Article 24, and I will bring to this conversation today some of the aspects crucial for this article. And third, I will summarize some key aspects of the committee's concluding observations in the last year under Article 24. So I will refer explicitly to the concluding observations and recommendations on Estonia and France, which are states at the European level, state parties to the convention at the European level. So I hope this is it is a bit clear. And I will start with the first part, which is the scope of Article 11 of the Convention and Article 24 of the Convention. As you know, the CRPD is the first human rights treaty to set out binding obligations on state parties for the protection and safety of people with disabilities in situations of risk. Article 11 of the CRPD is entitled Situations of Risk and Humanitarian Emergencies. It requires governments, state parties to the Convention, to take, in accordance with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situations of risk, including situations of armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and the occurrence of natural disasters. Article 11 requires governments to consider how all other rights are applied in situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies. So with this, I would like to emphasize that for the committee and following the legal framework of the Convention, Article 24 of the Convention and Article 11 of the Convention are interlinked and should be applied during the COVID-19 pandemic, which in many countries it is still an ongoing situation and in the recovery period. This framework of the Convention has also been echoed and has also been recalled by other human rights mechanisms. This is the case of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, which in 2016 issued a resolution entitled Realizing the Equal Enjoyment of the Right to Education by Every Girl. But what does it mean in terms of equality inclusive education during emergencies? Well, this resolution of the Human Rights Council recalled the normative framework of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention of the Elimination against all forms of discrimination against women, and recall member states to the Human Rights Council and urge all states to strengthen and intensify their efforts to realize progressively the equal enjoyment of the right to education to every girl, such as by taking necessary and appropriate measures to address, to address the rate of dropout from school among girls, to help to ensure that every girl completes a full course of high quality primary and secondary education and training and has equal access to all levels of education with the proper support and reasonable accommodation of the individual's requirements and without discrimination of any kind. I would like to refer to this paragraph. I brought this paragraph to you because it clearly states the elements of Article 24 of the Convention, reasonable accommodation of individual requirements without discrimination of any kind. This resolution also applies to different contexts of emergencies, and in the resolution, member states of the Human Rights Council were recalled to support access to education of girls in emergency situations, migrant, internally displaced and refugee girls, and those in humanitarian crisis, including in armed conflict and post-armed conflict situations. I only would like to remain that apart from those, from this explicit reference to the right to education, in this case, girls with disabilities and girls everywhere, there is also a resolution adopted by another of the main entities of the main pillars at the United Nations, which is the United Nations Security Council, and in which it expressed the parameters and criteria of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to protect the rights of persons with disabilities in emergency situations, including in conflict situations. This resolution was adopted in 2020. So second, and also for providing more elements to your discussions today, is the scope of Article 24 of the Convention. Article 24 of the Convention provides that ensuring the right to inclusive education entails a transformation in culture, policy, and practice in all formal and informal educational environments to accommodate the different requirements and identities of individual students, together with a commitment to removing barriers that impede that possibility. This is a textual element of the committee when explaining the changes that are required to ensure inclusive education. Is a transformation of culture and the transformation of educational environments to accommodate the requirements of students. For the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, children with disabilities, the committee has highlighted that children with disabilities have been and are one of the groups that face the most discrimination in education, in particular children with intellectual disabilities, children requiring high levels of support, children with autism, and those who are deaf-blind. The CRPD was the first legally binding instrument that explicitly enshrined the right to quality, inclusive education to all children. And this also has been complemented by the Sustainable Development Goal. What elements of the right to inclusive education are important to be considered today in the period of the pandemic? So first, the fact that the right to quality inclusive education is not compatible with sustaining two systems of education, a mainstream education system and a special segregated education system. This goal and the transformation of education environments should continue being a priority for state parties under the Convention. It cannot be suspended, it cannot be postponed or delayed. Second, inclusion involves a process of systemic reform involving changes and modifications in content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, and strategies in education to overcome barriers with a vision serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and the environment that best corresponds to their requirements and preferences. What does it mean in terms of the pandemic? The pandemic put additional barriers to inclusive quality education for children with disabilities due to the confinement, to the lockdowns, and homeschooling or schooling only on online basis. What were the type of individual support and accommodation provided to children with disabilities? This is one of the first questions. Were these instruments effective enough? Were these measures, did these measures included all children with disabilities? Were designed with universal designs? Were the online platform accessible? Were children with disabilities entitled to access reasonable accommodation while in homeschooling? And third, and this is also one of the elements of Article 24 in relation to the present pandemic. The committee has highlighted that placing students with disabilities within mainstream classes without accompanying structural changes to, for example, organization, curriculum, and teaching and learning strategies does not constitute inclusion. Early intervention, accessible learning environments, and individual support must be provided in all phases of education process for ensuring the inclusive education. The committee has strongly called different state parties to guarantee that all children with disabilities can realize their right to education on the basis of equal opportunities, equal access without discrimination, including in removing barriers to access reasonable accommodation on individual basis. What does it mean? And this is one of the examples that the committee has touched upon, that students with disabilities who are put or enrolled in mainstream schools, but still are maintained in separate or segregated classrooms, are not enjoying and are not benefiting of the right to quality inclusive education. The committee has clearly stated that and has clearly assessed that situation, including in relation to state parties to the convention at the European level. Just to remind all of us that the 2030 development goals also has a framework compatible with the convention and requires member states to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. I'm not going to refer to all the different targets and indicators of Goal 4 for the sake of time, but it is important that all of us take into consideration that this framework also is complementing the convention and it should be continuously applied in reference to the convention. So the third part of my presentation today, and I think I'm also running out of time, and is that I will only refer to two observations and recommendations that the committee issued in 2021. The first one in relation to Estonia, and the second one in relation to France, two state parties to the convention. So in the first case, the situation and the concern was in relation to the COVID, the barriers faced by children with disabilities in gaining access to quality, inclusive education within a context of distance learning during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the restrictions on school attendance imposed for children with quotations, chronic diseases and experiencing symptoms, again quotations, similar to COVID-19. So that was the main concern in relation to the situation of COVID-19. In that occasion, also the committee referred or expressed some concerns about the limited reasonable accommodation for meeting individual requirements and for providing individualized support. So what were the elements that the committee put forward for recommending the state for a specific action? So first, the committee recalled again all the core components of General Comment number 4 and Target 4.5 of the Sustainable Development Goals, and requested the state party or recommended the state party to establish a policy framework that recognizes the right of persons with disabilities to seek individualized support as reasonable accommodation in education when so required. It also required the state party of Estonia to take measures, including the provision of technical equipment and the adoption of regulations to ensure that children with disabilities, especially those in rural areas and those facing economic hardship, receive the individualized support they require within a quality, inclusive education system during the COVID-19 pandemic, and to guarantee for children with chronic diseases equal access to a school. In this case, I would like to explain that the committee included the element of children in rural areas, excuse me, and children facing economic hardship, because in legislation, all children had the possibility to access technical equipment. And even the state party was providing technical equipment to children with disabilities, to students for doing and for attending homeschooling. However, the problem was that children facing economic hardship and in rural areas were not accessing or were not receiving this type of technical equipment in the same pace of other children with disabilities. So in this recommendation, this short paragraph, you could see there are different elements in principle. First, reaffirming the whole content of Article 24 of the Convention, quality and inclusive education. Second, the committee addresses intersectional discrimination, which is that discrimination, for instance, faced by children with disabilities due to disability and also due to the place of living, the geographical zone, children in rural areas, or due to an economic situation, children facing hardship. So you can see also this strand of the committee's recommendation, and of course the concrete measure of providing the technical equipment and adoption of regulations in this realm. And last, we have recently the committee adopted the concluding observations and recommendations on France. The committee held its constructive dialogue with France during its 25th session in August-September 2020, and in its concerns, also the situation expressed different concerns about, for instance, the failure of the state party to provide reasonable accommodation for children with disabilities, especially deaf children, in the context of school closures during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in this, concerning this like children facing the situation of COVID-19 pandemic, but also other children with disabilities, the committee expressed the insufficient statistical information about children with disabilities, including in the overseas territories of France, who are enrolled in and attending school on a full or part-time basis, and about to access to inclusive education of Roma, asylum-seeking and refugee children with disabilities, and children with disabilities in an irregular migration situation. Why I would like to refer to these two specific concerns, because these two specific concerns, which include children with disabilities in the context of COVID-19 pandemic and children with disabilities belonging to Roma people, or who are asylum seekers or refugee children with disabilities or in irregular situation, are affected by emergency situations and also are facing intersectional discrimination. So only to finalize and to recall what were the specific recommendations, the committee recommended the state party to promptly implement the recommendations issued by the special rapporteur on the special disabilities concerning education, and also to develop systems to collect data on children with disabilities disaggregated by age, place of residence, sex, and ethnic background, including information about the percentage of enrollment in and attendance at the school, and ensure that Roma, asylum-seeking, and refugee children with disabilities and children with disabilities who are in irregular migration situation have effective access to education. There is one challenge that has remained throughout the pandemic, and is the insufficient information, is the hidden statistics, the hidden information about the real impacts and the situation of persons with disabilities, including children with disabilities during the pandemic. This effort has been filled by the efforts done by civil society. For instance, the disability rights monitoring COVID-19 that was established by several OPDs, organizations of persons with disabilities, and civil society organizations during 2020, and in which persons with disabilities, state parties, NHRIs had the opportunity to report on. Apart from this effort and some specific local efforts to collect data and to really show the impact of the pandemic and the crisis on persons with disabilities, there are not much or not official records. It is still missing. So the committee recommended also that the state party adopt programs at the municipal level and involving public and private actors to provide support for children with disabilities in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Why municipal level? Because the big challenge in the state party, as the committee asserted when assessing the fulfillment of the general obligations of the convention, was the coordination between the national level, the national legislation, and the municipal level. So this is why you will find this element. And I will conclude here. Thank you so much.
Ms. Pedreros, thank you very much for your intervention. I'm sure that it must have been challenging for the committee and the secretariat at the beginning of the pandemic to adjust to the existing situation. However, what I have observed, you had a very swift response, and you published a statement in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, which served as a guide and helped NHRIs in their work, we were using, for example, in Georgia, these guidelines as well. So now I would like to give the floor to Miss Maurice Pigot. I'm sorry for mispronouncing. Miss Maurice Pigot, who is a representative of the EDF, European Disability Forum. She's during her presentation, Ms. Pigot will focus on the importance of inclusive education for learners with disabilities and EDF's approaches and advocacy work in this regard, also challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic. She will also explain what the UNCRPD says about inclusive education and what would EDF like to see the EU do to help support inclusive education. Ms. Pigot works in this field more than 23 years, and she was awarded with a special order from the British Empire on her advocacy work. Ms. Pigot, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katerina. The European Disability Forum is delighted to be part of this discussion today and congratulates the Human Rights Institutes of Europe for bringing this issue to the fore. Education is such a vital issue for all people, but in particular for children and adults with a disability, because the quality of their education and education experience determines the child and young person's future, their friendships, their position in society, their concept of themselves, and their opportunities and likelihood of employment in the future. Just to tell you a little bit about the European Disability Forum, EDF is the umbrella organization for organizations of persons with disability in Europe. Our members are the national councils in every EU state and in many European countries beyond that, and also the European level organizations representing various disability groups and their families in Europe. In EDF, we're very clear that we advocate for inclusive education, fully recognizing that that's complex and sensitive, and that people with disabilities are a heterogeneous group that challenge education systems to meet their needs and to follow the obligations of the CRPD as outlined very ably by Catherine Pedreros. But why inclusive education? It's not just because it's a good thing and a right thing to do because of a duty and an obligation in international law. All of the research shows that inclusive education benefits all children. The benefits to children with disabilities are that they achieve higher academic qualifications when compared with children and young people with disabilities who attend special school settings. Inclusion also supports the social and emotional development and the self-esteem of children with disabilities and increases their social acceptance by peers. All children benefit by learning to be more accepting of diversity in all kinds and have increased sensitivity to the needs of others. This is a benefit for the whole of society, not just for people with disabilities. Teachers who learn to support learners with diverse learning styles are better teachers, and all learners benefit from the skills that they develop. So it improves the education for all. Educating students with disabilities also has economic benefits. It leads to greater participation in employment, future income generation of benefit to the individual and their family, and of course to the national GDP. And there are potential efficiency savings from operating one education system rather than two parallel education systems. And so using increasingly scarce resources more effectively in a single inclusive mainstream system makes a lot of sense. When we talk about education, we are talking about lifelong education. It's very important to start in the very early years with inclusive early years education. And of course, education continues lifelong. It's important for us to remember that there's vocational education, third level education, and that these also need to be inclusive. And in a world in which work and employment and the skills required change very quickly, training and retraining also need to be inclusive so that disabled workers can keep up and have career progression throughout their lives. So the principle of inclusive education needs to start in the very early years and continue through lifelong and continuing adult education. Although inclusive education has been the policy in very many countries for a very long time, it has not been achieved perfectly in any country. Italy has a long tradition of inclusive education with a strict principle of not placing learners in segregated settings. This is rarely the case, but in all countries, it's always possible, even in countries with high levels of segregated education, we can still find examples of good inclusive education. And the battle continues to get the states to make the effort to reform their education systems, to build the capacity of teachers and schools and administrators to fully embrace the principles of inclusion. I'm pleased to say that in that fight to move towards inclusive education, we have had the support of the human rights institutions and equality bodies in Europe. And recent examples were with Inclusion Europe and EDF. We were supported by UNIA in Belgium in taking both the French-speaking system and the Flemish-speaking systems for education to the before the Council of Europe as being in breach of their obligations, and won those cases. So strategic litigation is one of the possible tools in our toolbox. So we make progress, but it has been disappointingly slow. We're now at a very important point. As other speakers have said, the pandemic exposed just how fragile the inclusion of people with disabilities has been, as they were the most excluded in the crisis, often with very tragic consequences. But what can we learn from that, and what can we do about it? The most dominant feature of what happened in the pandemic was the rush to online learning, remote learning. And in that, we discovered how ill-prepared we are for that, and especially for learners with disabilities. The online platforms and the learning materials were inaccessible to very large numbers of people with disabilities. Many of the platforms were totally inaccessible to learners with visual impairments. They were also inaccessible to learners with intellectual disability. The lack of diversification in the materials, the lack of flexibility in how systems operated, meant they couldn't be adapted to the specific needs of learners who were either slower to learn or had sensory impairments. But the problems with the devices and the materials were only part of the problem. There were problems not only with accessibility, but with access. The presumption that everybody has an internet connection was found not to be the case at all. Even in Ireland, our study done by Inclusion Ireland showed that 11% of the families interviewed did not have access to the internet at all. So there's access, accessibility, and also ability. Teachers were not prepared for the switch to online learning. Parents who became the supporters of their child's learning were not prepared for the switch to online learning. And the combinations of platforms, devices, and access to broadband or mobile data introduced so many variables that interfered with access to learning for all children, not just for children with disabilities. And then there was the question of affordability, because disability and poverty are linked. So families of children with disabilities are less likely to have the devices and access to the internet that are necessary for participating in remote learning. But even with all of that, those turned out not to be the main barriers. And referring back again to the study that Inclusion Ireland did, they found that the biggest barrier to participation was the child's motivation. 78% of parents reported that the difficulty was that the child did not accept them as the teacher. They were used to doing things in a particular way, accepted the authority of the teacher and the school as the place where you did the learning. And also being away from one's peers and routine made it very difficult for children to learn. The other barriers were the other children in the household, the distractions, the competition for the scarce devices, and access to suitable devices and broadband. 55% in the Irish study had access to broadband. So it's not universal. And to give a practical example, one family reported, I have 5 children, 2 with special needs. I spend from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. doing homework. We have 2 laptops between 5, but the internet keeps breaking down. So those were the practicalities that families were faced with. And the danger now is that because we moved so rapidly to remote learning, and there was some success in doing it, that education authorities attempted to think that this is the answer. So we need to be sure that the total requirements for access to digital learning are understood. More studies need to be done to actually show what kinds of supports are needed to enable people to be able to benefit from the digital learning opportunities that are available. So then we got past that horrendous period where many children got no education at all, and all fell further behind, and we're now back at school. What has been learned, and what can we learn to keep moving forward? The lessons were the lessons that I suppose we've always known, and that is that individual approaches and diversified learning, having a clear learning plan for each child that takes account of their special needs, keeping contact and getting feedback, communication between the school and the home, between the teacher and the child, between the child and their peers, are the things which promote success. I'm not going to say much about the CRPD because I think that Ms. Pedreros covered that very comprehensively. But I would like to just reiterate the key principles, that the right to education applies to all children. And in order to have inclusive education, several things are necessary. First of all, non-discrimination. All children, with and without disabilities, should be able to access education without discrimination. Non-exclusion. No child should be left behind. Children with disabilities must never be excluded from the general education against their will and against that of their families. Reasonable accommodation in educational settings. And this should never be decided by the child's diagnosis or impairment, but by looking at the particular barriers that this child faces, not making assumptions. And support individual education plans designed for each child and with their full involvement and that of their family and teachers. Trained teachers and classroom assistants are critical for making those education plans work. So where do we go from here? And what would we like the EU to do about it? So this is a tricky question because it is one of these areas in which the EU does not have competence, but there's still a lot that the EU can do. And of course, one of the things the EU has up its very large sleeves is the distribution of funds, and particularly the new European Social Fund Plus. We'd like to see this money used through the member states to train teachers and classroom assistants in involving learners with disabilities in ordinary mainstream settings. If that were included in the country's plans, we would see an enormous difference, developing the capacity, both pre-service training and in-service training for teachers and assistants. It's not just the teachers and assistants, it needs to be the leaders as well, the principals or head teachers and the administrators in the education system. It takes a whole system approach. Some of those funds could also be used for hiring more classroom assistants to offer personalized support to learners in the classroom. Money can also go towards the provision of assistive technology, such as screen readers or Braille, to enable learners with disabilities to study autonomously. The Regional Development Fund could be used to make the buildings more physically accessible and to provide the IT infrastructure, making sure that what is purchased is accessible. Accessibility of the buildings is very important, especially in the older school buildings, which remain inaccessible. But providing access to broadband and to technology in the schools is also something that regional development funds could be used for. The member states also have the opportunity to use COVID-19 recovery and resilience money to invest in educational reforms. And this is really the big opportunity. This is where we can do better than we did before. We can use it to build the resilience so that in the future, in any future crisis, children with disabilities are not abandoned and disregarded in the way that they were with COVID-19. So let's use recovery and resilience funding strategically and put inclusiveness and accessibility at their heart for people with disabilities, but also for others. And especially in countries where the levels of inclusion of learners with disability are low. For that to happen, we need to embed disability expertise at the planning level and find the consultants who can help with that. To do that, the most important way to achieve that is, in fact, to build a relationship with the organizations of disabled people in each country so that they can help with finding the expertise to advise the education systems and the other departments involved in making an inclusive system. The EU is also looking increasingly at digital education, and while that has opportunities, it also has risks. This is part of the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan. We need to work to make sure that digital education and e-learning includes standards for accessibility to reduce the risk of digital education being as exclusive as mainstream physical education in face-to-face settings. And in all of this, the human rights institutions have their role to play. You can help with identifying and building relationships with the disability expertise. Continue as you have done with the exchange of experience and identifying good practice, studying the impact of exclusion and the benefits of inclusion, and following the data to make sure that information is collected on the inclusion of people with disabilities in education from the start, from the early years through to third level education and continuing adult education. So thank you very much for what you have done. We look forward to seeing the benefits of your efforts in the future as we all recover from this pandemic and hopefully build better. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bigot. EDF is doing great work, and let me wish you all the best in your advocacy work. I think that we can draw important conclusions from your work, especially about the roles of human rights institutions in this process. Now we can move to the question and answer session, and I would like to thank you for your comments and questions. We have two questions at this moment. The first question is about how can countries use these principles and rules, which was mentioned by Ms. Pedreros, to guarantee that schools must be prepared also for people with disabilities, and what doesn't happen in majority of the cases. And another question is about NHRI's contribution to be able to make free access of softwares and other instruments for learning like Brailles and other IT tools, which are very expensive, and sometimes the persons with children with disabilities and their families, they just couldn't afford these expenses. So now I would like, maybe we can start from the last question about IT solutions for easy learning and how we can contribute in advocacy to make it free of charge or to have the programs in this field. And another question will go to Ms. Catherine later. Ms. Marias, please.
Well, there have been some very good initiatives about putting devices into the hands of young people with disabilities. especially when business gets involved and as they renew equipment, work with disabled people's organizations or their education institutions in their countries to make devices available. But more important than that would be planning from the beginning in education provision to make sure that the provision of devices is part of the education budgets, and to buy the right devices from the outset, to buy them with accessibility in mind.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Ms. Pedreras, if you are with us, the question is about the guidelines and rules, how it can be applied in a practice.
Thank you, Ekaterina, and thank you for the question from the NHRI. There are maybe three aspects that are important to consider. The first one is on the basis of all the process, and it is for state parties or authorities, stakeholders to adopt all appropriate legislative, administrative, and other measures for implementing the rights of the convention. So this includes that when we are facing like a situation concerning human rights that we would like to promote, to advocate for, or to generate a change in the approach, it is good to think about these three aspects: the aspect of the legislation, what is the legislative framework, and what that legislative framework in the state party is telling the decision makers about what to do, for instance, regarding to education. The second aspect, and if there is any need to reform, to update that normative framework concerning education, so that would be the first step. And the second part is concerning policy reform or public policies, administrative measures. This is not only to look at the strategies, how strategies are formulated, but or what is the content of strategies, for instance, in education, to ensure that education is of quality and is inclusive and not segregated, but it is how the public policies are being designed. And in the how, the key question is, are persons with disabilities through the representative organizations engaged in the processes to develop and are being reached out, are being consulted? Are they involved in the public decision processes concerning, for instance, the educative reform or long-term or short-term policies in education? And also a key aspect of the how public policies are being adopted is how persons with disabilities through the representative organizations were included in the design of the response programs during the pandemic and now during the recovery phase. Ms. Maureen mentioned several examples of what is happening and what are the real problems and challenges that persons with disabilities, students, children, and adults are facing in the last, have been facing for the last year and a half. And I think persons with disabilities are in the best position to really call the attention of policymakers to take the appropriate measures. And third, but for me, it's really the challenge of the convention and for us working on the scope of the rights of persons with disabilities is the attitudinal change, is the change in the environment and the acceptance of society, of schools, parents, children with disabilities, students, of persons with disabilities and children with disabilities being their peers and benefiting also from all the support and accommodation to access education on an equal basis. I think that if there is a really conscious, sustained, well-funded strategy to remove attitudinal barriers, that would bring change to our societies. Thank you.
Ms. Maureen, Ms. Catherine, I would like to thank you once again for your valuable comments and for your interesting presentations on subject. Now I will pass the floor to Dr. Iris Elliott, who is the Head of Policy and Research at the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. She will be moderating panel 2. Ms. Iris, I will ready on spotlight. Okay. Yes, Ms. Iris, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Also, thank you for the honour of this invitation to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and thank you speakers who have come before me and your moderation up until now. So I suppose just some opening remarks before I pass on to our three esteemed contributors to the panel. Some thoughts from Ireland. So although the pandemic has highlighted and amplified, firstly, rights violations and inequalities experienced by people with disability, and also highlighted how some states have incredibly limited engagement with CRPD, but also the NHRIs and the national equality bodies. That's been a bit of an awakening for ourselves, I think, in IREC. You know, there has been this disproportionately negative impact of the pandemic on persons with disabilities across all impairment groups. And I think we are only beginning to really understand what people's experiences have been at different waves of the pandemic, and also then the impacts immediate, mid-term and long-term. But certainly we've really benefited from the community of human rights and equality actors from the very start of the pandemic, from March 2020 onwards. Reference has been made to the value of the work of the CRPD committee in terms of statements and also the ongoing reviews. I think these have been an incredibly useful resource for all NHRIs. Also the work of the Special Rapporteur on Disability and the group of Special Rapporteurs. We've relied heavily on their commentary throughout the pandemic, certainly in Ireland. And of course the ENRI CRPD working group, which has just stepped up in an incredible way, and rather than simply just continuing to manage to operate, has just been an incredible resource to ourselves as an NHRI. I think in terms of the scope of the discussion, just to pick up a few things that people have already mentioned, that what we are talking about here is education across the life course. We're talking about different forms of education from early years right through to lifelong learning. We've spoken about how the focus, although is on Article 24, there's clear interaction with other key articles. So Article 11 has been mentioned, Article 27 on work and employment, obviously Article 7 on children, but a reflection for ourselves in Ireland, and this may be part of where we are at the moment, is there's been a lot of focus on Article 4.3 and the obligations of the state around participation of persons with disabilities, and also the interpretation and application of General Comment 7, and that has been a kind of key area of focus for us in Ireland, including trying to establish a forum for children and young people with disabilities to advise us as the NHRI, but have a voice in wider discussions, as has been said, around legislation, policies, services, etc. As I've said, we're trying to make sense of, you know, what the experience has been and the impact at different waves of the pandemic, but we've also tried to create a discourse around a just transition and a just recovery, and as other colleagues have mentioned, looking at where we can use some of the resources we have in the European region. So the European Union's National Recovery and Resilience Funds, other streams of funding, work that's already been done on disaggregated data and how that can be applied in this context. And also, I think maybe part of the conversation today can also be about the European Year of Youth in 2022, which has a very strong focus on, you know, the leadership of young people, the diversity of young people, and their experience of being significantly impacted by the pandemic, but how they're part of how Europe and the world transitions from the pandemic as well. So those are just some initial thoughts. I'm very happy to talk about some of the things that we've practically done in Ireland as the NHRI during the pandemic period. But without further ado, I want to invite our colleague, Ms. Branka Miak-Sewi to speak. Branka is working as an advisor to the Disability Ombudsman in Croatia since 2009. She's primarily working in the area of international cooperation, representing the Office abroad and reporting to international bodies, as well as covering the areas of access to higher education, the right to vote, and the media. So thank you very much, Branka.
Thank you, Iris, for these kind words. It's my great pleasure to address you today on behalf of the Croatian Office of the Ombudsman for Persons with Disabilities, but also our European network, Equinet. So I will start by saying a few words about Equinet and its work during the pandemic, with a special focus on our practice gained from its members in the area of education. As you will hear, and as I was able to listen to all the previous speakers, I will echo a lot of their insights and conclusions, because it seems that we all, although coming from different countries, share pretty much the same experiences in the course of pandemic. I will also share insights that emerged following the survey we at the Office of the Ombudsman conducted here in Croatia, where we sent a survey to all regular and special schools in Croatia to gain an insight into the situation of pupils with disabilities in this context, and will conclude by some lessons we learned and recommendations which can serve for improving not only the situation of pupils with disabilities in the pandemic, but in general. As you all know, Equinet is the European Network of Equality Bodies, which is a membership network organization of 47 equality bodies in 36 European countries. The network facilitates peer-to-peer learning and exchanges, as well as informing equality law and policies at the European level. Since its members cover a wide base of discrimination grounds, they were able to gain a really comprehensive perspective on how COVID-19 has affected different vulnerable groups across the board. And as we all agreed, it became evident that vulnerable groups were affected most adversely. Among very comprehensive work that Equinet has done in the area of monitoring the pandemic, I would like to particularly draw your attention to the publication entitled "Recommendation for a Fair and Equal Europe, Rebuilding Our Societies After COVID-19, which can be used as a minimum standard based on laws and common European values in the measures to be taken following this pandemic." What Equinet members noticed in the area of education is that at first persons with disabilities and pupils with disabilities seem to have been forgotten by authorities when enacting COVID rules, as is often the case. And after that, most complaints that the bodies received stemmed from taking a one-size-fits-all approach, without due regard to the nature of each disability and the needs stemming from those. As we have already heard today, we also confirmed that there was evident a lack of resources and funds. And when many schools started to provide lessons online, accessibility hasn't always been considered. Also, as we heard, we also evidenced a lack of individual assessment and approach to pupils with disabilities. There were also issues with not accepting persons and pupils with disabilities for courses in person, assuming that just because of their disability, they belong to a risk group, although they have a certificate stating the contrary. There were also cases in which homeschooling was not allowed, stating that the educational needs of a child wouldn't be able to be fulfilled in that way. We also evidence lack of classroom assistants and special aids. And I was in particular surprised to hear that there was a problem with some basic internet access and basic lack of basic devices, which also became evident in the survey we conducted in Croatia. The survey we conducted was actually in response to complaints we've been receiving from parents of children with disabilities who told the Ombudswoman repeatedly that online lessons and platforms used for their delivery were not adjusted for pupils' disabilities, leaving them at a disadvantage. They also complained about lack of assistive devices and classroom assistants. So we sent a survey to all regular and we still have special schools, and the response rate was over 50%. So we gained a good data that were enabled us to gain some interesting conclusions. I will just, it was really comprehensive survey, so I will just like to save the time, highlight a few of our findings. It was interesting that the teachers in the survey didn't always agree and confirm the complaints we received from the parents, but they both agreed that online lessons, at least in the way they had been carried out, were bad and inadequate for all pupils, and in particular for pupils with disabilities. Most teachers in Croatia carried out teaching through a combination of real-time lessons and sending assignments, which put parents of younger children and those with higher support needs into roles of teachers, which, as Ms. Maureen highlighted earlier, was a very difficult role for them, especially since we in Croatia don't have a tradition of homeschooling, and parents and families had to balance a number of other obligations, their work commitments, other children, and that put all the families under a huge stress. However, in our survey, there was like a little silver line that emerged, and there was a slight positive aspect that some of the participants highlighted, while indicating that online teaching had a positive impact on some categories of pupils with disabilities, such as those with attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, which were able to organize their time and learning more efficiently with online learning. So that also goes to confirm that one size for all doesn't work again, and that indeed we shouldn't entirely dismiss online learning for the future, and that it could, if improved, work even and improve educational outcomes of some children. What also emerged in Croatian context is that particularly disadvantaged were pupils with high support needs, those who attend special education schools, where they weren't able to meet COVID prevention measures requirements. They didn't have enough space to guarantee to enable social distancing. They didn't have enough toilets, so they opted for actually leaving those pupils at home instead of risking their health by accepting them to schools when all the mainstream schools reopened again. So some of the recommendations that actually teachers who work directly with pupils with disabilities highlighted in our surveys is that digital tools and platforms as well as teaching materials need to be adjusted. As we have already heard, all the shortcomings of the teaching methods and curriculum actually got exposed, particularly in the online context. So the lesson we have all learned is that school need to improve those to benefit all the children, and then again, particularly children with disabilities who are most affected by these inefficiencies. We also heard already that teachers and parents could both benefit from training on how to use new technologies. And schools also need support from the government and clearer guidance. That was one of the most common messages that teachers expressed in our survey. A new, more interactive curricula should be developed, accompanied by video materials. Teaching materials should be designed with a view of being adjusted for different proficiency levels and different abilities. So even without the pandemic, we should abandon one-size-fits-all approach and allow for more flexibility in teaching, which will benefit all pupils and pupils with disabilities in particular. So to save time for questions and answer, I will finish my input here. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Branka. And perhaps either in the chat function or at a later stage, we can circulate some of the findings from the work in Croatia that you've undertaken. So without further ado, I just want to then move on to introduce our colleague, Anat Ilves. She is going to present on the challenges, opportunities and lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic around right to education from the perspective of the experience of the Ombudsman of the Republic of Latvia. Annette's background is varied. She's got 3 master's degrees, 2 in law and 1 in social sciences, and she's 15 years of experience in the legal field, a whole range of different expert experience, and has a particular expertise on equal treatment and non-discrimination on the grounds of disability, gender, age, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion. And she has initiated and led projects on research, including accessibility of higher education for students with disabilities and guidelines on reasonable accommodation for employers with disabilities, for employees with disabilities. So over to you, Annette. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will have a presentation, so I will try to share it if possible. Share screen. Okay. So, do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay, so, okay. Then I will tell you about our office experience, and just to give them overview of this presentations framework is that I will talk about education and basically starting already from preschool, which is in our country, it is already from 1.5 years till university. And in university, of course, as long as you want to study, you can go to university. I will cover the topics regarding teachers, pupils, and students. I'm not going to talk about the cases which we have dealt regarding parents' involvement in all of this process, because sometimes parents can directly or indirectly be involved in this as well. And time period, I will talk about this year only, because before that, everything is already irrelevant, because the rules changes in Latvia every 2 weeks. And so even January situation is not important right now anymore. And I will talk about the emergency situation in Latvia, about lockdown, about the end of emergency situation and lockdown, about starting emergency situation again and lockdown again, because right now Latvia is in lockdown again. So first, I will inform you about the cases which we have faced regarding the education, and I will cover special and mainstream education, because children with disabilities who are in mainstream education, they face basically the same issues as everybody else in mainstream education. We have had a case regarding the prohibition to take toddlers till wardrobe during the adaptation period in kindergarten. So idea is that in Latvia, when children start to attend kindergarten, parents can be present there as well. And during the emergency situation, it wasn't allowed in all kindergartens. So basically, we said that this is individual approach, and in every kindergarten, and each kindergarten should solve it within itself. Then after the emergency situation ended, and there were talks about going back to in-class studies, then some teachers approached us saying that they are afraid to go back to in-class studies, so they wanted that this remote study situation continues. And we said that, sorry, but this is not the best interest of the children, and remote studies are not good for children, especially for younger children. So teachers have to find some other solutions, and we understand that they might be afraid to go back to study as they were afraid to get sick. Then we have had several cases regarding obligation to wear masks, as the parents were against this, especially for the younger age children, like from 1st to 4th grade pupils, and also parents whose children had asthma complained about that as well. And in both cases, we said that you have to follow the obligation. There are no research that masks are doing actual harm. And doctors actually pointed out that if children with asthma get COVID, then they can actually be more sick. They might have a worse condition because of that. So masks can protect them from that. Influence of mental health. Well, yes, I think it's widely discussed everywhere. So this is nothing new. So it hasn't been good, and we believe that there will be long-term influence because of that. And actually, teenagers are the ones which face particularly heavy problems with these remote studies. And isolation in general. Then we had the case about remote studies for children out of family care, and who or which institution is responsible for providing them with tools for studies. And we said that local municipalities have to take care that these children have computers, that they have internet connection, so that they can study. And municipalities actually followed through that as well, which was nice. Then some schools have entrance examinations, and usually they put one particular date. We said that this is not an option anymore due with COVID time. They have to have several dates for their entrance examination. So just in case if some pupils are in self-isolation or sick due COVID, then they should have the possibility still to take the exam and be enrolled in the school. Then, of course, we got complaints from parents which didn't like that schools are closed. Well, that children have to study remotely. And we agreed with that saying that in-class education is the best. And then condition for going back to in-class education was that the pupils had to give a saliva test for testing COVID. But this was actually a problem for children with a particular type of disabilities. For example, children with intellectual type disability couldn't understand what is asked from them. And in case if this test would be taken forcefully, then they would be afterwards way too worried and afraid actually to attend the school. So violence is not good in general, but in this case would also the rise to education would be problematic, and we said that the government should provide alternative solutions for this saliva test. The government did, which was very nice. And then another case was students. So already the third level education university students were complaining, saying that they are discriminated if only students with COVID certificate and those recovered from COVID can have in-class studies. We said that this is not a discrimination, and that this is normal to make sure that everybody is safe. And right now we have a second case where education institution that provides higher and secondary level education allows in-class studies with certificate only for secondary school pupils, but not for students. So this is an equal attitude. So we are investigating this case. And right now there's also a case in Constitutional Court of Latvia on remote education after the emergency situation. So the situation was that in spring, emergency situation ended, lockdown ended, so it had to be made sure that that students can go back to in-class studies. However, schools were kept closed, and right now parents have made a complaint in Constitutional Court. Constitutional Court has started the case. Ombudsman's opinion was asked, and we said that this is a breach of education because government actually couldn't provide any information of proportionality and legitimate aim. And again, I'm pointing out this is a situation after the emergency situation ended, not during the lockdown or not during the emergency situation. So what we have learned during these several years that digital skills have improved, which is good. Education sector actually considers that maybe for older pupils like high school, this remote education can be a part of education also after pandemic in particular format and in particular sense. But generally, remote studies are not equal solution for in-class studies, and they can be used only for emergency situations. Right now, we have increase of unequal education, especially in quality-wise. Education content has decreased by 30 to 50%. Increase we see in mental health problems, and remote education is not an option for special schools, and it's not an option for first or third grade pupils. So there are, as older children can do remote studies, then there are some categories which can't. So opportunities. So let's try to be positive and see how exactly we can use the situation to change for better. In 2017, Ombudsman Office conducted research on accessibility on higher education for people with disability, and then we found out that 76% of our universities actually had their own digital environment. Yet the problem was that not all professors use this digital environment because of lack of digital skills. Right now, everybody is forced to use these digital environments, which means that right now is great time to give also more information about how to make information accessible for students with disabilities. However, it is necessary to think up the best strategy, because we have to take into consideration that the rules for schools mostly change every 2 weeks. So the teachers and professors, they are pressed by the school administration, by the government, by the teachers, by their students or pupils, and then they have to manage also their own lectures. They have to give this content to children or to students. So if we just come and say, okay, there's this very nice, great principle about alternative communication ways and tools, it's not going to work. The way how it's going to work is show how to do that, basically. So in 2017, we made guidelines on how to make Word, PDF, PowerPoint presentations and scanned documents in accessible formats for students with vision disabilities. That was information material meant for universities. Then also some universities had guidelines on how to work with students with vision, hearing, and learning disorders. So basically, such guidelines are also very helpful for teachers if they are very practical. And the last 3 points in my presentation is mostly, it's more like brainstorm on information, what is needed, kind of like, for example, information on difference between acoustic loops and FM systems for students with hearing disabilities. and if and how to use those in remote studies. For example, when we had this research on higher education accessibility, then back then already some schools provided the remote studies, but they mentioned that these video audio lectures do not work for people with hearing disorders because they don't hear good enough. So the idea is that if the school has these FM systems, can they be used to make sure that these remote studies are also better? Also, how can we use already existing these digital tools? For example, Zoom and Teams, they both have automatic subtitles. However, there are two questions. One is about languages, and another is about is artificial intelligence trained to understand different topics? For example, can Zoom subtitles understand topics about chemistry, physics? Are they trained enough to not to make mistakes? Because also if somebody is learning remotely with subtitles, for example, to become a doctor, it's kind of important to know the right terminology, because then otherwise something can go majorly wrong. And another option is about Zoom and Teams. Well, I think Teams had 28 languages. From, let's say, smaller language group, which is similar to users in Latvian language, we saw that there are Finnish language, Danish language, and Dutch language. However, what about other languages, smaller languages? Because the subtitles can be good for people with hearing disabilities. And right now, when I see a sign language translator, I can say that we recently faced the problem that we organized also one Zoom meeting, and it is necessary to know which buttons to press to make sure that sign language translator always stays in front, not jumps somewhere behind. So such, it seems teeny tiny information, but it's very crucial for everybody to understand how to make the information more accessible, not only for the schools, but also for the conferences, for example. I don't have COVID, it's just, I'm sorry for coughing, not COVID, it's just thing from kindergarten. And well, last time is how to provide real-time subtitles in classrooms. For example, not all countries can have enough sign language translators to make sure that they can also participate in education process. However, if the country has these artificial intelligence created subtitles, can they be used also in the moment when we go back to in-class classrooms? For example, we recently had a conversation with one of our IT companies, big ones in Latvia, and they said, oh yeah, it's super easy. Basically, the teacher has to have some microphone, it has to be connected with computer with a particular program, and if the school has a screen, then basically everything can go on the screen as a subtitles. So such small information, it's very, very necessary to know also to the teachers, so that they can provide this accessibility for all students. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I have cough.
Thank you so much, Annette, for that contribution. We're going to extend this panel just to 3 minutes to the hour, just so that we have the 3 presentations, and absolutely encourage colleagues to put comments or questions into the chat function. So if I now invite Ms. Romana Swikova to contribute on the impact of extraordinary measures on the people persons with disabilities and the public defender's recommendations issued on these measures. Romana is a lawyer in the Department of Supervision over Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the Office of the Czech Public Defender of Rights. She specialises in inclusive education and supervision over public guardians of people with limited legal capacity. And prior to joining the Ombudsman's office, she worked in advocacy. So welcome, Romana.
Thank you for your invitation. Dear colleagues and guests, good morning or good afternoon. I'm the last one, so maybe in some point I will repeat what my colleagues already have said. I would like to briefly introduce the measures issued in the Czech Republic, the impact they had on people with disabilities, and mainly the steps we took and the recommendation we issued on these measures. So one of the measures to mitigate the pandemic was the closure services, including daycare and work-week residential facilities for people with disabilities, where they are often educated as well. Based on the findings of a non-profit organization, we have appealed to the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs with a request to speed up the process of releasing certain restrictions of services whose description had a huge impact on people with disabilities and their families. These people often had to work and took care of severe disabled members of their family at the same time. We had also repeatedly asked the minister to find a form of personal assistance and financial support for families whose members were unable to use the services due to the pandemic, but at the same time, they had to pay a fee for staying a member in this facility. Even with the help of our initiative, the measures were eventually changed in favor of people with disabilities. Of course, there has been issued also an obligation in the Czech Republic to wear a mask, just like in many other countries. But previously, there had been almost no acceptation from this duty. So similarly, we approached the Minister of Health with a request to extend the range of people who were exempted from wearing the mask. We pointed out that the number of people with disabilities could not comply with this measure for objective reasons. These include people with severe forms of physical, mental, or combined disability who are unable to put a face mask on, breathe with the mask, or it can also make worse mental illnesses and its manifestations, for example, panic attacks or anxiety. The minister granted our request finally. Another government's measure had measured at reopening of special schools. After months of lockdown and distance learning, I think Czech Republic is the country which the most days that the children spend in lockdown. Starting the end of May 1990, parents had been able to choose whether their children would attend the school or would still be distance learned. However, the minister had defined in the guidance that this choice does not apply to children with disabilities. School classes for these scholars with disabilities were to remain closed until the end of the school year. So we had also asked the Minister of Education to reconsider his original decision to restrict the schooling of children attending special school facilities. Therefore, the Deputy Ombudsman contacted the Ministry of Education with a request to allow children with disabilities to have an access to education with the same conditions that apply to other children. The minister granted this request as well. In her submission, the Deputy Public Defender stated that the action had been understandable and probably well initiated, but it had been barely possible to accept that children with disabilities would be treated differently and that such differential treatment could be substantially justified. We found it discriminatory. After all, it cannot be assumed that a disability gives rise to a worse health condition automatically, that is risky in the context of COVID. Intermethodology assumes this across the board, when children with disabilities are being treated differently without adequate justification. And this is contrary to both the Education Act that is valid in Czech Republic, as well as the Convention on the Rights of the Child and CRPD as well. So children with disabilities eventually returned to school later during June, although unfortunately In these cases, they return to their special schools, not schools with included education. We also appealed to the Ministry of Health because of the measures issued back in the spring this year that stated screening testing of students and pupils all over Czech Republic in order to attend school personally. We contacted the Minister of Health on this matter. In our recommendation, we expressed our dissatisfaction with the possibilities given to children with disabilities. The situation was very specific for scholars with severe intellectual disabilities, or for example, for scholars with autism spectrum disorders. If these children could not, for health reasons, undergo a preventive antigen test as a condition for personal attendance, these were considered as students whose school was closed due to an epidemic measure. Thanks to this arrangement, parents had a claim to the care allowance for persons taking care of a child. While the settings had helped to address the financial aspect of the issue, the educational, social, and psychological aspects had remained unresolved. So our recommendation was not granted. The minister argued that these children were not able to comply with basic hygiene requirements, let alone anti-epidemic measures to prevent the spread of diseases in the collective. It also stated that saliva antigen test could be used with the consent of the school facility. Furthermore, such test needs to be carried out on facility grounds. Also, the saliva tests weren't for free and had to be paid by parents or facultatively by school or sponsors. So payment for the non-invasive antigen test is only provided by the state when purchased for testing purposes in school facilities. Other tests may be paid for by the sponsors or by the parent. The Deputy Public Defender responded that we did not believe it is fair to require parents or legal representatives to pay for the tests themselves, nor for schools, which are not the investigators of the testing system. The Minister of Health should take these situations into account by providing more than one type of preventive antigen test for supply. Students who are willing to comply with the testing requirement in order to access face-to-face education should not be denied in the school facility just because they are not provided with reasonable accommodation by those who set the testing system up. We had also criticized the Ministry of Health's claim that the risk of spreading the disease to these children is higher without providing any specific data that would prove this statement. Also, we believe that the possibility of testing in the home environment in the presence of legal guardians should be considered for those of the children that are not able to take the test in school because, for example, mental issues. In the case of more severe disabilities, where the child is generally unable to be tested even in the home environment or only with undue difficulty, the exemption from testing should be considered so then that these children wouldn't be denied access to education. The new measure, which mandated screening testing of scholars during the month of September all across Czech Republic, allowed students who do not undergo preventive testing attending school, but wear the mask while in school and even in classrooms, not only in common areas. At the same time, however, the exemption from the obligation to wear mask for serious reasons was still valid. So this was the resolution for these students. But the medical certificate was needed, so the people had to undergo this medical examination. The last part of my presentation is related to government's measures. It deals with amendment of Healthcare Legal Act that has been put in power recently in Czech Republic. This amendment enables to provide health care in school facilities, which wasn't possible till now, because there's a number of children and students who either need direct professional health services or supervision during medication or other activities while in school. This can be both children with disabilities or chronically ill children who, although they do not have adjustments, cannot be in school without the provision of health support. Therefore, the Ombudsman Deputy met with representatives of the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health in September, followed by a meeting with the Central School Inspector. She called on them both to map the situation and to provide the methodological guidance to schools. And in this context, however, the Ombudsman has registered a huge amount of appeals of parents who are concerned that this creates room for vaccinated children against their parents' will, or that is directly made in order to vaccinate the children this way. So now it's work for my colleagues to explain this misunderstanding. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much to our three contributors, to Branka, to Annette, and to Romana. I don't see any questions or particular comments in the chat function from the during the panel. So perhaps if I just make some concluding remarks and then hand over to yourself to close the session. Just to thank everyone. Sometimes it's difficult to sustain participation for a block of time, but I think we've heard a lot of very rich and interesting and impressive work that has taken place by equality bodies and ombudsmans and national human rights institutions. Hopefully all of those presentations as they are can be shared, and obviously the session is going to be recorded. But I suppose what I've been really struck by is the real richness and breadth of different types of activities. And I know, as I said at the start of this session, we very much benefited in Ireland from the work of the committee, the work of the Special Rapporteur, the work of members of ENRI and Equinet. And I think as we're at this phase of the pandemic, it will be really helpful to almost make sense of this body of work, and then also for ourselves to have a sense of maybe a shared agenda going forward in terms of all of these different domains of work. At the start, I also talked about kind of maybe some of the things that people hadn't mentioned, and just some sharing from Ireland. As I said, we've a strong focus on participation, so we very much benefited from our statutory disability advisory committee, which really advised the Commission the whole way through the pandemic on particular areas of concern and raised areas of concern for the Commission's attention. We've got to work to develop a youth forum event, which has been postponed during the pandemic, but we had a really good reference group that we've benefited from advice over the period of time. One of the things that maybe we haven't got to have a conversation about is engagement with the parliamentary oversight structures, and that was very important to us in Ireland because there was a lack of engagement proactively by the state in terms of the response to the pandemic with ourselves as the human rights institution, but also national equality body. And therefore the Parliamentary Committee on COVID, the Parliamentary Committee on Disability was incredibly important to us. And so I think that's given us something to reflect on in terms of the work we will take forward as we're transitioning and recovering from the pandemic. And I'm just seeing a lot of appreciation in terms of the comments that are coming through. So I'll conclude our session and hand over to our colleagues in ENRI to conclude.
Thank you very much. Dear participants, let me express my gratitude for your active participation in the webinar. I hope it was interesting and fruitful, and everybody had the opportunity to share their views. I want to once again thank our speakers for their excellent presentations and interventions, and our moderator for excellent moderation of the second panel. Special gratitude also goes to ENRI for the support they gave us in organizing this webinar. I would like to also thank our sign language interpreters and captioners for their excellent work. Thank you very much and hope to see you soon. Thank you. Thank you for joining the webinar.
Thank you. Goodbye.